So a long time ago, I made a video basically supporting the idea that a lot of open world game design was outdated, and I kind of went into detail as to why. So I'm gonna put that video in the description so maybe you guys can get a bit of an idea as to why I feel the way I do about certain aspects of Elden Ring. If whether or not I like it or dislike it, whatever the case may be, that video will be in the description below, so that way I don't have to repeat myself too much in this video. One thing I will point out about Elden Ring is that I absolutely really like this game. Like I'm a very positive person when it comes to Elden Ring. I do very much like this game. But I do think that in this video I might come off a little bit negative, mostly because the way I'm going to talk about this game is to talk about primarily the reception it has gained in terms of whether or not this game is the new standard of open world design. I feel like when you look at open world design, there is like a spectrum of what exactly the game is going to focus upon. You have on one side the Breath of the Wild type games where essentially the open world is the main character, essentially, right? Where the narrative takes a bit of a back seat and the detail in terms of graphical fidelity and what NPCs are doing from a day-to-day basis takes a bit of a backseat to allow the most freedom of expression and the most open of the open world games. And I think of personally Breath of the Wild being the ultimate example of that side of the spectrum, while on the opposite side, when you're talking about NPCs going about their daily lives and the detail that the world has in of itself when it comes to, you know, people living their daily lives or simulation or the game just being highly detailed on a graphical level, I think of Red Dead Redemption 2 on that side of the spectrum. Elden Ring very much falls much closer to the Breath of the Wild side, but I do think that there were certain concessions made with Elden Ring that makes me feel like it is not the new king of the open world design in either way, really. One of my biggest reasons is that I feel like the beginning of Elden Ring starts off so strong. You start off coming out of that tomb or crypt, and you end up in Limgrave, and that to me is the best part of the game, the beginning of the game. Primarily because you have the main area of Limgrave, then you have the southern area, which is, you know, you cross the bridge, you get there, and then you have Caelid all the way on the right side of the map. As at this point in time in the game, you don't really have the full map yet, so the game feels massive because you just don't have access to everything yet. And there's even a situation where a chest will randomly teleport you into the city that you get to later on in the game. This section is the best part of the game, primarily because you're able to freely explore that area of Caelid, you're able to explore that area of Limgrave and the bottom area pretty much freely and in any way you want. Like, there's nothing really stopping you from doing it other than just dying through enemies. But I do feel like barricades done in the style of difficulty is the best way to limit me from going anywhere. I much prefer a game making accessing a location very difficult rather than giving me no way of ever accessing that area. So that is something I very much like about Elden Ring. However, as you progress through Elden Ring, the game progresses in such a way where it's kind of linear. You kind of have to get from Limgrave into Lorenia into the Altus Plateau, and then from there to the city, into the Field of the Giants, or the mountaintops of the Giants. And that all happens pretty straightforwardly. Like, you can't really go from Caelid to, like, say, the city in your first attempt playing the game. Like, you pretty much have to already had been there before for it to work, which is why I'm going to use that teleportation treasure chest as sort of an example in this case. The first time you do that and you get that treasure chest and you teleport to the city, the elevator that takes you to the rest of the city is not functional. You can't do anything with it. You can't access the rest of the city. Also, if, let's say, for some reason you get to Lorenia and Altus Plateau and you skip everything, you just don't fight any of the bosses and you go straight to the city, the game will directly have a barrier on the city, like the entrances of the city, not allowing you to actually go in there until you fight previous bosses, at least like a certain amount of them anyway. For this reason, I do think this game sacrifices a little bit of its open-ended nature for the benefit of the player, or at least what From Software believes would be for the benefit of the player. Clearly, not much people really minded, but it was something that bothered me personally when I was playing through the game, considering that, like, I am someone who likes to go through any open world in pretty much any order. Like I just start exploring in any direction I just feel like doing. So I wasn't a huge fan when I was barricaded from accessing certain locations. Mind you, in some occasions, the treasure chest like teleportation thing does take you from places that you could explore, but those are places you already have access to. Like from Limgrave, you can find a chest that will teleport you to a particular dungeon inside of Caelid, which is already a location you technically could have had access to. Don't get me wrong, it was cool. It was a very interesting and fun first time experience, but I've already had access to that area, so it's not necessarily as impressive as if I was able to, I don't know, explore the city the first time I went through that chest. It's a little bit disappointing on that end. So I do feel like on one hand, if a game is offering you a very detailed, in-depth narrative, let's use Ghost of Tsushima as an example in this particular talking point. Ghost of Tsushima is another open world game that is, in terms of how you progress through the open world, relatively linear. Like you have the ability to go do whatever you want in that current like zone you have access to, but you have to progress through the narrative in order for you to get to the next section of the island, which is fine. If you like those kind of open world games, that is totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not something that I typically am into personally, especially if I'm not that invested in the story. Like I feel like you have to make the narrative something that is really engaging for me to be able to, you know, live with that essentially. Ghost of Tsushima as a game sacrifices a bit of its openness and its open world structure for you to be able to go through the narrative. Like they want you to go through this narrative so that way when you get to the ending and you get to these emotional moments, they hit harder for the player. So in order for that to really have the narrative impact they intended, they made it so that the open world is sort of like put into a chokehold in certain sections, so you have to go through those parts of the narrative. Other examples in the opposite side, Breath of the Wild is a game that, while many people also love, it does sacrifice its narrative. Like, mind you, it does have enough of its narrative there to still be somewhat enjoyable, and they do use the open world to its advantage by offering things like Zelda's Diary and the King's Diary to kind of expand the story a bit, things like the Zonai and stuff like that, to really, you know, push that forward. And I think Elden Ring was attempting to go in that direction, considering From Software games in general don't really have a narrative that's like in your face. It's more something that, like, you know, almost like they're ripping the page of a history book and they let the pages fly throughout the land and you gotta find all the pages and piece the story together. That is also like a very enjoyable experience for certain people, and that's, like I said, okay. I actually like that for myself. I'm not huge on it, but I do like it to a certain extent. I liked it in Breath of the Wild. I liked it in Dark Souls 1. I'm not someone who feels motivated to do that every single time I play a From Software game, but I do like it in general. So I don't really have a problem with that. But I think the issue I have with the Elden Ring discussion when it comes to whether or not this game is the new pinnacle of open world design primarily has to do with, I feel like they limited the world a little bit too much for a game that was already going to make you explore and discover the story anyway. See, in Ghost of Tsushima, the benefit of limiting that world was to basically get you to go through the narrative in a straightforward way. From Software doesn't typically do that, right? So we know going in that we're gonna discover the story. We're gonna figure out what the story is. The way Breath of the Wild basically handled it is, you know, the way I expected it to go, more or less. However, I was not expecting it to also railroad the open world anyways, which was odd to me, because if you have no reason to do that, since your narrative isn't something that's meant to be experienced straightforward in a very, like, you know, cutscene heavy game, I don't see the reason why you would essentially make the open world relatively, like, railroaded in a way. Because like I said, it's not like you can go from Lavinia to the mountaintops of the giants. The world is designed in such a way where there's kind of like a straightforward, like, path in terms of the zones, right? Let me get this across. The world itself isn't linear. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the zones in of themselves go into each other in such a way that, like, you will not often be able to go from one zone you're at to a massively different zone. Breath of the Wild, I can end up in one straight walk, like walking directly there. I can go from the like the weird jungle area there and go all the way to the snowy mountaintops, right? I can't really get to the southern island and walk straight to the mountaintops of the giants in Elden Ring. I have to kind of like go through every other zone on the way there if I'm walking there, and it's my first time doing so. Like, you, in a way, they structured the game in terms of progression through the way the world is essentially put together. And I think that's a way I prefer if the game was like other narrative games. Like, I do think that's a good way of doing it because it makes it feel more natural. It makes the progression of the game feel more natural. But is this the best designed open world? I can't say it is. I can't say it is because it does feel like Elden Ring is a game where they took sacrifices that both games do without all of the benefits of doing so. They sacrifice narrative, which in the case of Breath of the Wild would result in a very massive freedom focused open world, and they didn't really do that. You're still very much limited as to which zones you can access at which times, and you're still somewhat limited. Like, you can't, like I said, you can't go into the city as soon as you want to. You have to kind of, you know, progress certain things, right, before you're able to do that. That also limits you from going to the mountaintops as soon as you want. They sacrificed a bit of that open world freedom for no narrative necessarily. I mean, like, there is a narrative there, but it feels like more involved version of Breath of the Wild where it's there, but it's not in your face. So it feels like it tried to do both things, and for me, I just kind of felt both of the sacrifices. But I know for many, it wasn't something they really felt, so I understand if that's not a big deal for most people. Elden Ring as a whole is definitely one of the best games within the year, despite those issues. There was also other issues I had with certain bugs and like exploits you can do within the game that I felt was just not very good. And while I'm no stranger to open world games having bugs and glitches, I mean, I've played Elder Scrolls, I've played Fallout, I played Cyberpunk, I played The Witcher. All of these games had some levels of bugs and glitches. That's not really the issue. The issue is more noticeable when the game has multiplayer. Now, when I was playing Elden Ring, some of these were patched out. But when I was playing Elden Ring, there was exploits like having invisible projectiles that would just home in and kill you. There was exploits like the Madness status effect would proc instantly within a single hit of a certain spell, and it would combo into itself. So if someone hit you with that spell, it was just instant death and you couldn't do anything about it. That's just how it was. A lot of things like that basically like also kind of made the experience a little annoying more than fun and challenging. Like I said, I've enjoyed the game. I'm not trying to hate on the game. If you look at my achievements, you can clearly see that I very much enjoyed the game enough to, you know, get every achievement in the game. So it's not that the game is bad in any way. It's still one of the better experiences I had within the year. However, I do think there's a lot of issues within the game, and I do think that there's a lot of places to improve upon. When it comes to a fun adventure, going through with friends, or, you know, good challenging boss fights, the game was enjoyable. I very much enjoyed the game, and I do think it is one of the best games From Software has ever put out. I'm someone who originally really loved the first Dark Souls, so I do think it's up there. It's definitely up there. As their first attempt at a true open world, this felt, for me anyway, very lacking. It didn't feel as massive as I wanted it to be when I first went through the game. And if anything, when I got to the, I want to say maybe the last 80% of the game, I kind of just wanted it to be over already, and that's not a good feeling you want to have for an open world adventure. I think other things I could fit in here that wasn't originally mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of an open world game where NPCs just kind of wait around for you to show up to do anything. You don't really see NPCs really walk to destinations and do anything. They kind of just stand there and just wait for you. I remember doing the Jar Boy questline where you had to talk to him repeatedly off multiple times, and you essentially just had to, like, at least for in my experience anyways, you just had to walk up to him, talk to him, and then because they wouldn't continue the questline without like you being there, I had to essentially just walk up to the to the grace, refresh the world essentially by just resting at it, coming back, and then talking to him again, and then it would continue the quest line, which just feels really bad to me. I mean, like I said, I feel like systems like that work perfectly fine in a much more linear structured game like Bloodborne or Dark Souls, but in an open world setting, it doesn't make the world feel real. It doesn't make it feel alive in some way. It feels very like archaic to me. I'm not really like a big fan of that. I much prefer if they had the characters continue the conversation, or maybe, I don't know, if it's a character where something's supposed to happen in between them, they actually walk over there and do it instead of just waiting for you to show up. Not a big fan of that. There is even a point in time in that quest line where that village that he lives at, the Jar Boy, gets attacked. You can't see the attack because by the time you get there from refreshing, the attack has already happened. I would have liked to see the attack happen. Maybe there's a point in time you can get there and you can watch the whole thing happen. Maybe there is a point in time where that happens, and I'm just unaware. If that's the case, feel free to comment that down below. Let me know. So far, everything just feels not alive in that world. The game itself was extremely enjoyable, but to say that this is the best of the open world design, I just don't see it personally. I think it is very good, and I like a lot of the things they do with the structure of the world in terms of not telling you everything. I really like that, and for that reason, I do think it's the most fun I've had in an open world since Breath of the Wild, but I just don't feel like it is the best open world I've ever experienced. And you know what? Even though I don't see Elden Ring as like the new pinnacle of open world design, it was still a really enjoyable game. So you know what? It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be the new king of open world design. It was just a good game, and that's all it really needed to be. But that's pretty much it. This video ended up way longer than I ever expected it to be. But comment down below how you guys feel about Elden Ring. Do you feel like it is the best game you've played since anything, really? Is it a masterpiece? Do you feel like I'm wrong and everything I'm saying is just because I'm bad at the game or something like that? Feel free to comment that down below. And that's pretty much it, guys. I really enjoyed the game, but I don't think it quite hits that masterpiece title for me. But that's all I have. So take care, and I'll see you guys in the next one.
Shifty, yeah, shifty. Wanna be the #1 gamer? Come and get me. It'd be dope if you subscribe. Could you like the vid, please? Take your time, you don't gotta do it swiftly.